online. It was not our place to interfere. Yet we chose to try and help mankind. And when we disobeyed the Creator, He punished us. We were encrusted by your world. Rock and mud shackled our fiery globe.
Have entered into contract with, and these aren't the only nations.
They've built laboratories and underground bases for these entities in exchange for forbidden knowledge that helps maintain their psychological, economic, and military dominance.
When it comes to the relationship between the U.S. military, the government, and the occult, these connections have been well established. It is a well-known fact that the father of American rocket science, Jack Parsons, openly practiced Satanism and performed rituals to obtain breakthroughs in scientific knowledge.
And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand.
Terrestrial humans interbred with us sometime in the last 5,000 years, and that could account for these monumental changes in the structure of human DNA.
Could it be that our ancestors are not only hominids who lived here on Earth, but also beings from beyond our world? Ancient astronaut theorists claim that evidence of this can be found in stories throughout history that depict humans mating with gods.
Throughout world cultures and mythologies, this idea of otherworldly beings, gods, supernatural beings, demons, having sex with humans is very, very common. The way that we interpret that experience depends on the cultural and religious factors around us.
We can read about these accounts of all sorts of weird beings who had their way with humans. All we have to do is to approach these stories and look at them from a modern perspective, to eliminate the always suggested symbolism and look at these events for what they potentially really were: encounters with extraterrestrials.
There is abundant, undeniable evidence of human and extraterrestrial interbreeding. It's in so many different cultures that to suggest that it's all a conspiracy theory or a myth or a fantasy is completely illogical.
I think the first mention of the Nephilim in the Bible, it's in Genesis 6, and it says the Nephilim were in the earth in those days when they procreated with the daughters of men. Now, I imagine when the Bible was written, people were supposed to know who the Nephilim were. Which brings up an interesting point, because how were people supposed to know this? Obviously there were other books around at the time that spoke of the Nephilim, and they were since lost. It's not really specific in the Bible exactly who the hell the Nephilim were, but they were basically beings who were not human, who came from another planet or another dimension. And that's really the idea behind them. The Nephilim were also mentioned in other books not included in the Bible, like the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is a discarded book of the Bible. He was a guy who lived before Noah, and he wrote a book or a series of books about his adventures before the flood. And it has a very interesting history. Enoch wrote about a race of beings called the Watchers, who existed in the land of Sumer. And Sumer is now modern-day Iraq. Around 9000 BC, these Watchers existed and interacted with men. And they were considered to be a race of blonde-haired giants, which is kind of cool, I guess. These were very interesting times because these watchers, or angels as they may have also been called, were considered rebellious, and they were looking at the women on earth and thinking they were attractive, and they had sex with these women, and they produced a race of beings known as the Nephilim. There was kind of like a big genetic experiment going on, or so it's indicated in the book of Enoch, because these Nephilim were often giants or creatures that were just bizarre and strange looking. And there was a real push in those times for people to prove their bloodline, to prove that they weren't part of the Watchers, or their lineage did not go back to the Watchers. And they thought actually Noah may have been a Nephilim at one point because he was born with blonde hair or he was very white. But he had to prove that his bloodline was not of the caste of the Watchers. And that's why God spared him and his family. So we have to ask ourselves, why is the book of Enoch not considered a part of the Bible? In Jesus' times, it was considered part of the religious text of the day. Jesus even quoted from the book of Enoch, and I think pretty much everyone in ancient times considered the book of Enoch to be a religious and holy document. So many copies of the book of Enoch were sent to Ethiopia, and they were rediscovered, I think, in the 1770s. Modern man took it and translated it, and there's been many versions of it that exist. And they compared the modern translation they have to fragments they found in 300 BC and found it to be pretty much identical. So whichever way you look at it, if you believe it's the word of God or not, that's beside the point. It's an interesting historical document, and it tells some pretty spooky stuff. A lot of stuff, I think, has been cut out of the Bible, which maybe should have been kept in. I think Moses probably considered it, the book of Enoch, the word of God, because as I said, he even mentioned the Nephilim himself in Genesis. So it was considered common knowledge that the Nephilim existed, at least when the Bible was written, or the book of Genesis was written. So he's obviously referring to something very specific. And the interesting thing was, the Nephilim, as it says in Genesis, were not wiped out. They existed after the Great Flood as well. So, I mean, there was a lot of strange things going on that are kind of mysterious to us. And that's why I think the whole thing's very interesting, and it's worth investigating and studying. Now, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the Emperor Constantine decided to put an end to all the warring factions of the Christians, because all the different Christians around the place were running off in different tangents, different ideas, kind of like a lot of them do today. There were some Christians who believed there was reincarnation. There were some Christians who believed that Jesus was a man. Some Christians believed Jesus was God. And he decided to unite all of the faiths and all of the books of the Bible into one New Testament. At that time, the Council of Nicaea took a lot of the books and rejected a lot of the books, things like the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, and other, I guess, historical works, and they were kind of discarded and thrown away. And many of these books were lost for a long time until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. The Dead Sea Scrolls were basically a collection of books that were put aside by the Essenes. And it's interesting to note that a lot of the Gospels that were banned were Gospels that spoke about angels and Nephilim and Watchers and similar sort of beings. So there's almost been a bit of a cover-up in history over the nature of who these beings were. Like the Gospel of Judas is a very interesting book. It speaks that Judas was on the inside track of knowledge, and he and Jesus had a special understanding, and they spoke heavily about angels or watchers or the hierarchy of angels in heaven and kind of how they interacted with man on earth. So there's more to this Nephilim story than, I guess, the first few words in Genesis. There really is an interesting history about it, and when you look into the historical fragments we have, I think there's some wisdom to be gained. Unfortunately, a terrible thing happened when the Library of Alexandria burned down in 300 AD, or approximately around that time. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls which contained the knowledge of the ancients were contained in this Library of Alexandria, and it was a terrible, terrible thing, because all this incredible knowledge was lost. And of course, it would include things like ancient books talking about the Nephilim and stuff like that. So we only have fragments. We're left with small pieces to try and put it all together. So I've taken some of those fragments and expanded on the idea.
When you transgress against it. And I know that there's a strong line of Christian thinking that's identified the conscience with divinity, sometimes with Christ inside, sometimes with the Holy Spirit. And those are very interesting conceptualizations, but you can think of them psychologically, and you can even think about them biologically. But the thing is the deeper you go into biology, the more it shades into something that appears to be religious. So you can think about Christ from a psychological perspective, and the critic, my critic, this particular critic that I've been reading, said, well, that doesn't differentiate Christ much from a whole sequence of dying and resurrecting mythological gods. And of course, people have made that claim in comparative religion. Joseph Campbell did that, and Jung to a lesser degree, I would say, but Campbell did that. But the difference, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out as well, the difference between those mythological gods and Christ was that there's a representation of, there's a historical representation of his existence as well. Now you can debate whether or not that's genuine. You can debate about whether or not he actually lived and whether there's credible objective evidence for that, but it doesn't matter in some sense because it does, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter because there's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief, and I don't understand it. Because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. That's Jungian synchronicity. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. We have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. We treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know what to... that seems to me oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. It's partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
If you believed in the story of Christ, or if you believed that history and let's say the narrative meet,
both, I think. I think because when you believe that, you buy both those stories. You believe that the narrative and the objective can actually touch.
The Nephilim were perverting all of God's creation and were attempting to replace God. We see that plan being carried out here at Teotihuacan. The city represents astronomical pyramids, temples with bloodthirsty sacrifices, and was built by giants. In Mayan mythology, a group of 4 protective deities, the sons of Itzamna and Ixchel, are giants who uphold the sky at its cardinal points. Just like Teotihuacan, these giants built the original pyramids as astronomical observatories. It is well known today the calendar of the Mayans is more accurate than our own. They understood the concepts of pi and zero. It is even thought they had a representation of a black hole, called the Dark Rift. Their understanding and knowledge reflected that of the Nephilim. The Nephilim were part angel and had a knowledge far superior than man's. These gods also instructed the people in bloody sacrifices. Even their games depict the dark path set for the Mayans. The image of a priest cutting the still-beating heart from a man probably delighted the Nephilim. We can only imagine their intoxicated and wicked laughter. The Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants tell how they devoured man in the worst way. They also created genetically altered beasts to help them in this quest. They were bound and determined to pervert all of creation. These temples tell us of their astronomical knowledge and their reprehensible past. The Maya were still communicating with the fallen angels, who were cast under the earth, and the Nephilim spirits in an alternate dimension. The Maya priests would alter their state of mind with hallucinatory drugs and spoke directly to the gods of the underworld. Even though the angels were already judged and doomed in the underworld, they were still communicating with those who would listen. Although the bodies of the Nephilim were destroyed, their spirits still preached to the Mayans and all other Mesoamericans. Women to a new strand of DNA, creating all sorts of monstrous beings. There were giants in those days, and also after that. In my research of ancient civilizations, I was surprised to find these bizarre elongated skulls in Egypt, throughout Africa, Europe, Russia, South America, on remote islands, and indeed all around the world. Who were these people, and what were these freaky skulls? I soon found out it's a practice called cranial deformation. It was an intentional practice which had its roots in ancient times. It was done for important people such as royalty and priests in order to mimic a fallen race of giants.
Another aspect that we have to consider is that skull and cranial deformation forming elongated heads is a practice that's known throughout much of the ancient world.
The pharaoh Akhenaten's family is a good example of this practice. His son, Tutankhamun, is probably the most famous example. But why was his deformed skull kept a secret and not taught in public schools along with his known history? The Discovery Channel recreated his head and intentionally modified it to look more modern. Not one word was spoken about his elongated skull. They also resurrected his stepmother, Nefertiti, and again nothing was said about the cranial deformation. King Tut's sister is probably the most pronounced deformation I've seen in Egypt. The Discovery Channel chose to filter out this information simply by ignoring it. It seems our public school systems have the same mindset. It's like the elephant in the living room. How can you possibly ignore something so bizarre?
As I said, over the past 150 years, these archaeologists and anthropologists have covered up as much evidence as they've dug up, literally.
Basically what you find is something we call a knowledge filter. This is a fundamental feature of science. It's also a fundamental feature of human nature. People tend to filter out things that don't fit, that don't make sense in terms of their paradigm or their way of thinking. So in science you find that evidence that doesn't fit the accepted paradigm tends to be eliminated. It's not taught, it's not discussed, and people who are educated in scientific teachings generally don't even learn about it. It's not necessarily a deliberate conspiracy in the sense of some people getting together in a smoke-filled room and saying, we're going to deceive people.
I discovered this practice was actually an effort to carry on the traits of their gods. But who were their gods? They were a race whose fathers were fallen angels and their mothers were earthly women, as explained in Genesis chapter 6 and many ancient texts. The Bible refers to them as the Nephilim, the fallen ones. The Mayans credited Kukulkan for their knowledge of astronomy. He was a giant all-knowing god and bore no resemblance to the dark-skinned Mayans.
The Maya described Kukulkan as a tall Caucasian man with long flowing silky white hair and beard and blazing deep blue eyes. He was said to have an elongated skull, and in fact, the Mayan women used to strap boards onto their infants' developing skulls to elongate the skull, and we have artifacts of this nature. The question was, who was Kukulkan?
Kukulkan was from the race of the Nephilim, just like the Titans and the Olympians of the Greek myths. Cultures all around the world have legends of the star people, the ones who came down from heaven and created a race of giants. In Sumeria, they were called Anunnaki. We know them as fallen angels, called the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6.
When people began to multiply and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, And they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Genesis 6:1.
Do angels have sex? The text tells us that the angels, they're called the sons of God, mate with human women and produce a race of giants as their offspring. Now, the story seems to represent this as something that displeases God. God doesn't like the idea of this mixing between the angelic realm and the earthly realm.
These genetically altered beings had elongated skulls and desired that mankind worship them as gods. Their elongated skulls were created by their bastard genetics. It allowed for the brain to grow to enormous size. This is where the practice of cranial deformation started. People began to mimic this trait in order to carry on the tradition of the giants. They are the very reason God, the Creator, destroyed all life on earth. They were an abomination in His sight, and they corrupted all mankind except for a few righteous people, the family of Noah.
They took infants' skulls and compressed them and bound them, and they forced the cranium out and elongated, and in many cases they doubled the size.
People have suggested aliens had elongated skulls, and apparently ancient peoples are mimicking those skulls. The old saying is that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
These ancient alien theorists attribute cranial deformation to aliens from outer space. They believe people saw them as gods and mimicked them. Part of this is true, but they were not aliens from outer space. They are from hyperspace, where they were sentenced by God. Now living in a parallel dimension, they are spirits and now called demons. God destroyed their bodies right before the Great Flood and sentenced their spirits to abide in this dimension.
What's really strange is that this is found all over the world. And this is something that archaeologists cannot easily explain. Because for people on remote islands, for people in South America or Malta or in Africa, to suddenly independently do this cranial deformation like this seems incredible. I mean, this is something that had to be learned, something that was taught to them.
We seem to have basic similarities, as if there was one civilization or at least one type of culture that was influencing people around the world. I find it more and more difficult to believe what I was taught as an undergraduate, that all these different cultures just coincidentally came up with the same concepts independently of each other.
These ancient alien theorists are right. This is a learned behavior. The practice of cranial deformation dates back to the antediluvian age. The Nephilim giants created this practice all around the world. We know a few of the giants, at least one, escaped the flood and was allowed to live with mankind, but was severely restricted now. When God separated men during the Tower of Babel episode, this learned behavior followed man throughout the world. It was especially prominent in the Americas, where the Nephilim were still worshipped as gods. The Paracas History Museum in Peru has one of the largest collections of elongated skulls. The Incas created some of the most deformed ones. These skulls are testimony to our ancient past and the bizarre story of the Nephilim, something most people can't accept because it defies what they have been taught. God destroyed the Nephilim's bodies because of the corruption and rebellion. He also brought judgment on their fathers, the fallen angels. These skulls should serve as a reminder of a disobedient race and their eternal judgment. Christ is returning for those who love Him.
has been identified on the metro. The train makes 2 stops at 20th and 33rd.
Send units to each location. We'll never make 20th. Have faith.
Directly into the internet. Imagine gaming, watching videos, or devouring whole books instantly without needing a screen. That's the bold new vision being dreamt up at the San Francisco offices of Neuralink, billionaire polymath Elon Musk's controversial new venture. But what actually is Neuralink? How does it work? And what are the real-world implications of this mental sci-fi fantasy? Join us today as we put on our thinking caps and learn the secrets of Elon Musk's new mind control device. The first thing you should know is that tech colossus Elon Musk is terrified about the rise of AI, or artificial intelligence. AI is overlooked by very smart people, he said before. That's because, in his view, very smart people do not think a computer can ever be as smart as they are. This is hubris and obviously false. Musk's chief worry is that, left unchecked, artificial intelligence will rapidly evolve beyond humanity's ability to manage and regulate it. Then, he frets, at some unknowable moment, human beings will become a mere nuisance to it, and it will dispose of us without hesitation or remorse. Musk's plan for tackling this existential threat is twofold. In 2015, he founded OpenAI, a non-profit consultancy dedicated to researching AI and steering the wise legislative oversight he feels the industry so desperately needs. And in 2016, he also founded Neuralink. In Musk's eyes, it isn't humanity's raw intellectual horsepower hobbling our ability to take on the robot master race. The human mind is plenty nimble enough to get by. Instead, the problem is what Musk colorfully refers to as our human bandwidth. Whether you're reading a Wikipedia article or listening to some seductively urbane narrator on a YouTube video, information is entering your brain at the leisurely pace of about 3 to 5 words per second. That's pretty lame from a bandwidth point of view. Computers, of course, can digest entire bookshelves in a fraction of that time, which puts mankind at a very obvious disadvantage. Enter Neuralink, which plans to beef up our bandwidth with a little help from a discrete, coin-sized intracranial device. And in order to make that happen, Neuralink needs to learn how to read minds. Here's how it works. Every time your brain performs a function, nerve cells called neurons chatter to each other across connections known as synapses. Everything your brain does, from lifting your right arm to processing the words I'm saying right now, involves a firing of specific synapses from specific neurons. Neuralink's nifty gizmo incorporates over 1,000 minuscule electrodes, each one just a tenth of the width of a human hair. These electrodes splay out into your brain tissue, passing near enough to those chatty neurons to overhear their activity. This activity is beamed directly to an external device, which will most likely be fitted over your ear. From there, sophisticated algorithms interpret exactly what you are thinking at any given moment. Here's the really ambitious bit. Musk and his team reckon they can also send traffic the other way, broadcasting information back into your brain through the intracranial device. To date, the company has set itself relatively modest goals, monitoring and interpreting brain activity in non-human mammals. Take Gertrude, the pig, who was implanted with a Neuralink device to help researchers track which neurons fired whenever her snout was lovingly caressed. More famously, Pager the monkey recently went viral after Neuralink posted a video of him successfully playing retro video game Pong using only the power of his adorable monkey mind. Pager started the experiment playing Pong the old-fashioned way with a regular joystick. Neuralink studied which neurons fired whenever Pager moved the joystick up and which fired when the joystick moved down. From there, it was comparatively simple for the Neuralink team to read those firing synapses and broadcast that info from Pager's mind directly to the console in real time without a joystick. Pretty cool. Neuralink's next trick is to install its intracranial device into a paraplegic human test subject. It's hoped this technology might enable those suffering with paralysis to access the internet without needing their fingers or clumsy voice controls. Beyond that, says Musk, it could help tackle other problems, from addiction to blindness. If this all sounds like some utopian sci-fi plot, Neuralink was supposedly inspired after Musk read a series of E&M Bank novels called The Culture. Just wait until you hear how it gets put in your skull. Those minuscule filaments we mentioned earlier are much too fiddly for a regular human doctor to be trusted with. So Neuralink has developed a $20 million robotic neurosurgeon to install those impossibly tiny filaments into your noggin in a manner described as akin to that of a sewing machine. Naturally, it's important the robot surgeon manages this without damaging anything important or causing unnecessary blood loss. This obviously means the company has some high regulatory hurdles to clear before going to market. As Musk himself has put it, getting FDA approvals for implantable devices of any kind is quite difficult. This will be a slow process. The benefits of Neuralink would be striking. Aside from trivial applications like online shopping or checking the football scores in the privacy of your own mind, the power to access the entire internet at will could spark a revolution in human creativity. Still, critics have their doubts. For starters, artificial implants anywhere in the body can and do frequently cause unforeseen rejection reactions. That's probably not something you want inside your skull. Neuralink engineers also need to make sure their device, and especially those wee filaments, is capable of resisting corrosion in the damp, briny intracranial cavity. There's also the very real threat of malfunction or computer viruses or even malicious hackers. Nobody wants to deal with a phishing scam happening in the confines of their own skull. Not to mention the labyrinthine moral and ethical implications inherent in this technology, quite apart from the whole animal testing thing. If a device can read your thoughts, translate and broadcast them to another Neuralink device, isn't that telepathy? How will this affect society and how we live and interact with each other? What does consent mean in this unprecedented framework? Musk, for his part, is characteristically upbeat about Neuralink's potential to enhance our lives, breezily referring to his new brainchild as a Fitbit for the skull. He's even said human trials might be on the horizon as early as the tail end of 2021, but bear in mind he has a reputation for mad, exaggerated timescales. Certainly, Musk's almost limitless financial resources are attracting top neuroscience talent to the team, and reports from the firm suggest no piece of equipment is too expensive to meet the CEO's ambitious deadlines. After all, if we're actually going to beat the machines, maybe quick thinking is the only way. What do you think? Are you excited to go online without needing a cumbersome screen? Or will intracranial devices turn us into a race of soulless cyborg zombies? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to hit subscribe for more utterly mind-blowing tech content.
It's a sensor.
This tiny green thing in there?
That tiny green thing in there, you put it underneath your skin, and what that tells you is that there are chemical reactions going on inside the body, and that signal means you're going to have symptoms tomorrow.
Wow. There's an actual transmitter in that?
Yeah, it's like a check engine light.
Check this sailor out before he infects other people.
That's right.
Sailors would get the signal, then stop them all.
That's it, lovely. Now, you may feel a small
Christ!
prick.
What is it?
Cutting-edge nanotechnology. Smart blood. Microchips in your bloodstream allows us to track your movements in the...
This is not science fiction. This is science fact. We have the tools, we have the technology to do this all right now.
And you think we can, at some point, inoculate the world against these killer viruses?
Killer viruses that we haven't seen or even imagined will be protected against.
Robotic human surrogates combine the durability of a machine with the grace and beauty of the human body. With most people living their lives through their surrogate selves, our world has become a safer place. Take a seat in your STEM chair, and just with the power of your mind, you can control your surrogate and send it out into the real world. You can live your life without limitations. You see what they see, feel what they feel, and become anyone you want to be from the comfort and safety of your own home. You can finally live the life you've always dreamt of without any risk or danger to yourself.
We are confronted with an unprecedented situation. 2 people have died while connected to their surrogates.
I think we may actually have a homicide here. First one in 15 years.
The public cannot be allowed to get the idea that using a surrogate can be fatal.
Especially if it's true. I just want to know how an operator can be killed by signals from a surrogate.
Surrogates have been blown to bits without the least bit of harm to their operators.
If it were possible, it would defeat the entire purpose of surrogacy.
Oh my God, Tom?
You're lucky to be alive. Good thing you're unplugged.
How long is it since you've been out without a surrogate?
Can't even remember.
It's different when you actually feel the pain.
What do you want from me?
My wife.
I am your wife.
No, you're not.
You can change the world and now you want to destroy it?
How do I stop this? You can't.
Maggie, get offline. I think something's going to happen.
It's up to you.
If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. For what is a man profited, if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange